There's no set moves in Half Sword. You're forced to learn how to fight on your own, which is why we're going to be looking at which historical longsword fencing techniques actually work in Half Sword. Now thankfully we can use all of the basic guards and attacks from the German longsword fencing tradition. And this is great for us because every single technique is built off of these basics. So let's first look at the 4 basic guards and the 4 basic attacks, starting with the first guard called Formtag, which has many different variations. Then we have Ox, which is another high guard, but with the point of your sword extending forward. And then we have Plow or Flug. This is a low guard, but the tip of your sword should be pointing at the enemy's face. And the last of the 4 basic guards is the Alber, or Fool's Guard. Now for the 4 basic attacks, and the first is the Zornhau, which is a downward diagonal cut. The next is the Unterhau, which is the exact opposite of the Zornhau. Then there is the Mittelhau, which is a horizontal cut. And the last basic strike is the Stiche, which is the thrust. Now let's look at some offensive techniques that we can use when these basic attacks do not hit our opponent because they parried our attack and are binding against our blade. In German, this is called a Binden, and this is when your weapon is in contact with your opponent's weapon. Now, one major advantage from being in the bind is being able to feel your opponent's movements. This is also called Fühlen. That's unfortunately something we're not able to apply, but that doesn't mean we're not able to understand our opponent's next moves in order to apply the techniques revolving around Binden. So instead, we simply have to rely on their body language and what they're telegraphing. Say our opponent just swung to the left. Well, we can predict that they're probably going to swing again to the right, so we can move our sword to intercept and start fencing from the bind. And from there, a whole host of techniques opens up to us, which is why Binden is so important. Even though the game makes it quite difficult to maintain blade contact, but we don't have to stay in the bind to use it to our advantage, like with this next technique called Abnehmen, which means to take off. And this is done when our opponent is strong in the bind, which means they have more control over the bind than you do. So instead of trying to stay there and fight it, you lift your sword up along their weapon and then come back on the other side. Now, not being able to feel your enemy's movements and the pressure in the bind that they have makes it a little bit more difficult to do in Half Sword than in real life, but if you pay close attention to their weapon movements, you can do this just fine. And there's actually quite a few different techniques on how to disengage so that you know how to do it safely, whether you're retreating or opening a new line of attack. And that's where our next technique comes in, Durchwechseln, which in English means to change through. And this can be done by lowering your point and going underneath your opponent's weapon, coming out the other side and thrusting to their opening. Normally, you would want to be in the bind when doing this, but in Half Sword, it can be difficult at times to maintain blade contact. Now, of course, we could apply the underlying concept of the technique without even being in the bind, but if we can be in the bind while changing through, it will give us so much added protection. Like here when I went under my opponent's weapon and then entered the bind on the outside line. And as you can see, his line of attack is completely blocked off. Now, of course, he could easily parry our attack by moving his weapon to his left. But that's where the Durchwechseln shines. Because if he were to do that, I could simply drop my weapon and change through again, entering the bind on the other side and then thrust. That way, I'm always keeping my weapon in between his weapon and me. But instead, he opted to move his billhook to the right, which allowed me to make a clean thrust while simultaneously keeping his weapon away from me. If you want to try what I just did out yourself, you can double click to stab and then use X to wind your sword around. But you have to be careful when you change through and or leave the bind, otherwise things like this can happen. So instead of leaving the bind and leaving my left side open to his plançon, what I should have done is when I was changing through and entering my stab mode, I should have transitioned into my left side before stabbing him. That way I could use the bind to keep the spikes away from me. The next technique is called Umschlagen, which means to strike around. Historically, this is done from the bind, using a Zerkau-like motion to strike to a new opening. But in Half Sword, we can't chain Zerkaus together, we can barely do half of one. But we can still use the idea of Umschlagen to gain an advantage over our opponent. So when we do this in Half Sword, we're going to be less worried about the bind and more worried about timing. When our attack is parried, we're going to immediately attack around to the other side. That way we don't give them time to counterattack and we keep initiative. And that's going to force our opponent to defend again unless they want to get hit. But when doing this, we're going to have to pay close attention as to not get hit as well. The next technique is called Zuken, which means pulling. The Zuken is yet another technique about leaving the bind, but it can also be used to avoid a bind when your opponent seeks your blade. In doing so, we can exploit the opening our opponent has made once they missed. And of course, the wider your opponent swings, the more of an opening you'll have, which is why this technique works great in half sword. And if you've seen my previous video, you probably are noticing that this is very similar to Nachreisen as well. And that's because Zuken uses the concept of Nachreisen, which is to let your opponent's attack fall short of you just so that you can attack them after they miss. But Zuken is more deceptive. We're saying our weapon is here, but when they go to seek our blade, they will find themselves open instead. The next way we can use pulling is when we're in the bind, and instead of using the Durchwechseln going under, which would signal to our opponents that we're still trying to attack them, we can simply pull our weapon back, making it look like we're disengaging. And as you can see, this has also allowed us to clear our opponent's weapon, which gives us a clear line to thrust. But from here, I opted to parry because he decided to travel after me. But once again, I found myself in a very similar situation as before, so I used Zuken again, this time slicing his arm in the process, and then landing a thrust. In half sword, the deceptive part of Zuken is not going to be helpful because we're fighting AI, but the mechanics of the technique is still very beneficial. So far, we've only looked at offensive techniques and ways to get around our opponent's guard. But now, let's look at some defensive techniques that we can use in half sword. Starting with the Versetzen, which means to set aside or displace. These aren't just your normal parries, because the masters warned us about straight parrying, which is when you parry with your weapon far to the side or with your point not threatening. This often makes it difficult to regain initiative unless your opponent allows it. Instead, we should parry in a way that we can immediately threaten our opponent, and this can be done with the four Hangen, which are as follows: left plow, right plow, left ox, and right ox. Cutting into these guards or winding from one to another can parry all incoming attacks, while allowing you to set up a counterattack instantly, which is exactly what you want to do to regain initiative. Now, we are using the simplest understanding of the four Versetzen because we're trying to keep things as straightforward as possible so that we can apply it in half sword, since Willy does have some physical incapabilities. Like when cutting an Unterhau, Willy has to let his sword flop before you can get into Oxguard, unless you've entered the bind after performing an Unterhau and are using your opponent's weapon to push your point down. Or their face. Okay, that's the position your sword should end up in after performing an Unterhau without your sword having to be inside somebody's face. But we can wind into Oxguard from one of the other hang-in perfectly fine. The only problem with this is that if we try to hold one of these guards for even just a second to close off a line of attack, the auto parry system that's in the game will actually move your weapon. As an example, I move into my right ox here to close off my opponent's line of attack, but the game for some reason thinks my sword should be over here for absolutely no reason, and then I get absolutely clobbered. And I have to fight against auto parry constantly. I really feel like there should be an option in the settings to turn it off because it seriously messes with you. And if you guys are in the same boat as me and hate it and want that option to turn it off, make sure to leave a like so that the devs might see this video. But until we get an option to turn the auto parry off, using the two upper Hangen is going to have to be a very in the moment thing. But there's still a lot of uses for them, like with our next technique, which is the Absetzen and the Ansetzen. These are actually two different techniques, but they're very similar. Absetzen means setting off, and Ansetzen means setting on. What it means by setting on is that you're setting your weapon onto theirs. So unlike the Versetzen, which is a parry and then attack, with the Ansetzen, we're looking to do it all in one motion. Instead of waiting for them to attack and then reacting, we can simply shoot the point, which can displace their weapon at the same time while you thrust. And this works because the fastest path between you and your opponent is the tip of your sword. And because you've beaten your opponent to the center line, their weapon will get pushed to the side if they contest that space. Hence, setting on. Now with the Absetzen, which means setting off, instead of setting onto their blade to displace it as we thrust, we will wind into our Hangen, thus setting their blade off as we hit them simultaneously. When he strikes or thrusts at you, set aside his blow and in the same motion, strike or thrust him. Now honestly, the Ansetzen is more usable in half sword right now, and that's definitely due to the auto parry. Because with the Ansetzen, we're actually stabbing first, which means the auto parry can't mess with us. But with the Absetzen, you're winding as you stab, or I guess you're winding as you cut, but it just looks like a stab because your tip is pointing forward. So the auto parry is able to mess you up before you even start the attack. Now while this technique is more difficult, it's just so satisfying to use. The trick is to get your point under their weapon and then wind into Ox, and if you're at the right distance, you're going to hit them. If not, you still parried the attack, and then you can retaliate. I will say that this technique works best against spears and weapons like that, because they tend to not swing their weapon around as much, which is going to allow you to use the Absetzen more often. Our next technique is called Streichen, which means to stroke or to sweep. The principle of this technique is to deflect attacks by cutting in opposition, which will set us up for our own attack. We're actively sweeping our opponent's weapon aside while we prepare our own attack, but at the same time, we've just created the opening for that attack as well. Now, there is a technique that has similar properties as the Streichen, and that is the Wechselhau, which means changing cut. But we want to apply these techniques in a way that makes them straightforward as possible, since we're bound by only a keyboard and a mouse to control a whole character. That doesn't mean we're unable to use these complicated techniques in half sword, it just means the more intricate the movements involved in these techniques, the harder it is to consistently execute them. So let's break down the Wechselhau and how it's different from Streichen. We start by performing an Unterhau, but instead of throwing a Zornhau from our left side like we do with Streichen, we transition to our right side before attacking, hence why it's called the changing cut. And this is yet another technique that allows you to get past your opponent's guard, just like the Abnehmen and the Durchwechseln does. Next we have Abschneiden, and this means cutting off. Now there seems to be some debate about what exactly we're supposed to be cutting off, whether we're cutting off against their sword or their arms. But in half sword, the interpretation that I think works the best is cutting off against their arms. Instead of waiting for them to attack and then having to parry, we can attack into their preparation, targeting their arms to avert the risk of us getting hit as well when we attack into their preparation. Now if their hands are higher than ours, we can cut from below to stop their attack. And if their hands are lower than ours, we can cut from above down onto their arms. And not only does this allow us to stop their attack prematurely, it also allows us to potentially disable their arms, which would give us a huge advantage in the fight. And since this has allowed us to gain control over our opponent's weapon and their arms, we can enter into Ringen Armschritt, which is wrestling at the sword. Now if they're wearing armor on their arms, the Abschneiden isn't going to work as well because they're going to be able to push against your sword, as you can see here. But where the edge of our sword fails, the point will surely succeed. Well, that is all the techniques that I had for you guys today from the German longsword fencing tradition, and I hope you found this video helpful on how to apply these techniques in half sword.